Here's a thought. If you're gonna ignore what J.R.R. Tolkien wrote, why even adapt his stories? Several months ago, I made a video about the Wizards of the Coast Tales of Middle-earth cards. Now, I'm not into tabletop games, however, The Lord of the Rings is the source for most fantasy games, so it's a no-brainer to make something like that. In recent years, however, Wizards of the Coast have leaned heavily into identity politics, so there was no chance they could create this new deck and stay true to Tolkien's descriptions of his world and characters. No, Tolkien's world of Middle-earth is too white and too male, so Wizard decided to ignore what Tolkien wrote and instead race-swapped many characters, specifically characters whose skin colors are described in the books. This obviously set off fans, which in turn set off the posers and virtue signalers, which in turn got the topic to trend on social media, which is probably what Wizards of the Coast wanted. What makes this situation different is that Tolkien's works are clearly inspired by Northwestern European cultures and are specifically built around English culture. Altering the appearance of the characters essentially strips away one of the things Tolkien wanted to do with the stories, reclaim the lost folklore of England. For those who are unfamiliar with Tolkien's works, he loved folklore, but was saddened that much of England's folklore is either borrowed from or heavily influenced by the French. The idea behind the Tales of Middle-earth is to recapture those lost stories in tone, structure, theme, and culture. And it's that last bit, culture, that's important, because culture is defined by the people who live within it, not just by their actions, language, music, and general activities, but also by their appearances. Their appearances and the preferences associated with that are woven into their culture, folklore, and mythology. When you alter the people, including their appearances, you alter their culture. With rare exception are they inseparable, and Tolkien's works are no different. His work is an English story, and as a result, the principal characters are Caucasian. However, Tolkien never states that white people are the only humans in the world of Arda. He says the opposite. There are the men of the South, Haradrim, and the men of the East, Easterlings. These two groups could respectively be considered Black and Asian. However, they are not the focus of the story. Tolkien's stories are chiefly about the elves and the men of the West, all of whom, according to Tolkien's descriptions, are white. So it's fair for people to expect any depictions of Tolkien's characters to be white, especially in cases where he specifically states that they are white. Which leads us to Aragorn, King of the Posers. Tolkien describes Aragorn as having, quote, a shaggy head of dark hair flecked with gray, and in a pale, stern face, a pair of keen gray eyes. So you got two of those wrong, Wizard. I don't see any gray eyes, and I damn sure don't see any pale skin. I also don't see Anduril, Flame of the West. I do see the Sword of Power from He-Man, and I'd like to know why you're not getting sued by Mattel. This is not Aragorn. It's not even fanfiction of Aragorn, it's a completely different character, and that's kind of the point. Leave it to Kotaku to state the obvious because why scrape the bottom of the barrel when you can just bury yourself under it? From Sauron's taint we get this soiled insight, quote, Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth is to be revealed in full on May 30th when the mechanics of how the CGC will play are revealed. But ahead of this announcement has come the very welcome news that Wizards of the Coast and Middle-earth Enterprises plan to make the Third Age a far more representative time to live in. Which is to say, not everyone's white. And if you're feeling the need to start writing a comment about the ethnicity of the Scandinavian nations that inspired, just close the article down now and move on. Your blood pressure is bad enough. My blood pressure is perfect, which is why I can calmly tell you that his works are not strictly inspired by Scandinavian nations, and what influences they do have are limited primarily to the dwarves. I can also tell that you know you have a bad argument when the best clapback to criticism you can make is, shut up. And that is the best argument this dude can make, because his follow-up argument is all kinds of stupid. Quote, fortunately, for those whose imagination can somehow cope with magic walking trees and actual dragons, but not different melanin content and character skin, there's still plenty of blazing white fantasy out there in which they could take solace. You do realize that's an unbelievable self-own, right? Because you're basically saying that the people you're siding with, who possess such incredible imaginations, can't cope with a single fantasy story having a white cast. These people are so fragile that if they can't see themselves reflected in the characters, meaning the characters have to look exactly like them, well, they can't even. They can't read the story, they can't relate to any of the characters. The only way they can connect is if all the characters are melanated. And this is despite Tolkien's story already including diversity via all the races, or really species. The very thing they're asking for already exists with the elves, men, dwarves, orcs, and hobbits, and how they interact with each other. If you can only see yourself in characters when they look exactly like you, you miss the point of the story. Ironically, Wizards of the Coast admits this. On their page announcing the cards, they state that they had two goals, one of which was diversity, but admit that, quote, "The Lord of the Rings is about the different peoples of Middle-earth coming together to fight Sauron, finding strength in their diversity. Fans of all backgrounds have been enjoying these stories, characters, and locations for decades, and we wanted this set to reflect that broad inclusion." It's already there in the story. Tolkien's works have been translated into over 100 different languages. People around the world have enjoyed his stories for decades. They already feel included. That's why the stories are so popular. They don't need you to do anything else but draw what he wrote, and they damn sure don't need your so-called originality. Quote, "The goal of this set is to express the story and is a modern take on the work of J.R.R. Tolkien, lovingly crafted for an ever-expanding fandom." No one wants a modern take on Tolkien's stories. Your job is to take what he wrote and make pictures. Your job is not to change his work. That's not just my opinion or some fan's opinion, that's Tolkien's opinion. When a Dutch publisher asked for his approval for changing the names of locations into Dutch, Tolkien said this, from letter 190, quote, "I hope you and the Foreign Rights Department will forgive my now at length writing to you about the Dutch translation. The matter is, to me, important. It has disturbed and annoyed me greatly, and given me a good deal of unnecessary work at a most awkward season. In principle, I object as strongly as is possible to the translation of the nomenclature at all, even by a competent person. I wonder why a translator should think himself called on or entitled to do any such thing. That this is an imaginary world does not give him any right to remold it according to his fancy, even if he could in a few months create a new coherent structure, which it took me years to work out." Right there, Tolkien slaps down this idiotic argument I've seen numerous people make, claiming that because this is a fantasy story, because none of it is real, it doesn't matter how the characters are depicted. Well, if that's the case, then why do you want to change the characters? If they can be whatever anyone wants them to be, then why can't they be like their creator intended? If it doesn't matter because it's not real, then there's no reason to change anything. The argument itself is pure nonsense because fantasy stories function under a set of rules. They have to, because if they didn't, the audience would have no idea how the fantasy world works. The general rule is that unless the author says otherwise, the fantasy world's rules follow the same rules of the real world. So, unless the author says people can fly, you should assume no one can fly. If it's based in a medieval setting, you should assume that it follows the rules of the real medieval period until the author says otherwise, and that includes who people that culture. If the culture is clearly inspired by feudal Japan, you should assume the people are Japanese until the author says otherwise. The author is the one who decides the rules of the world, and those are the rules that everyone must follow. You do not get to come in and change it just to suit you. This is exactly what Tolkien argues in his letter, quote, "I presume that if I had presented the hobbits as speaking Italian, Russian, Chinese, or what you will, he would have left the names alone, or if I had pretended that the Shire was some fictitious Loamshire of actual England. Yet actually, in an imaginary country and period, as this one, coherently made, the nomenclature is a more important element than in an historical novel. But of course, if we drop the fiction of long ago, the Shire is based on rural England and not any other country in the world, least perhaps of any in Europe on Holland, which is topographically wholly dissimilar. The toponymy of the Shire, to take the first list, is a parody of that of rural England, in much the same sense as are its inhabitants. They go together, and are meant to. After all, the book is English, and by an Englishman, and presumably even those who wish its narrative and dialogue turned into an idiom that they understand, will not ask of a translator that he should deliberately attempt to destroy the local color. Tolkien is telling the translator, the Dutch publisher, and his own publisher that the languages he created and the cultures that inspired them are integral to his work. You can't simply change them to make them more Dutch to allow the Dutch to see themselves in the story without fundamentally changing the tone and intent of his story. He takes great offense at these changes, getting into the minutiae as only Professor Tolkien could. I encourage people to read the whole letter, it's amazing. He ends with this perfect pimp slap, quote, "May I say now at once that I will not tolerate any similar tinkering with the personal nomenclature, nor with the name/word hobbit. I will not have any more humpen, in which I was not consulted, nor any hobel or whatnot. Elves, dwarves, trolls, yes, they are mere modern equivalents of the correct terms. But hobbit and orc are of that world, and they must stay, whether they sound Dutch or not." If you think I am being absurd, then I shall be greatly distressed, but I fear not altered in my opinions. The few people I have been able to consult, I must say, express themselves equally strongly. Anyway, I'm not going to be treated a la Mrs. Tiggywinkle, followed by something French that I'm not even going to attempt. Not that Beatrice Potter did not give translators hell, though possibly from securer ground than I have. I am no linguist, but I do know something about nomenclature, and have specifically studied it, and I am actually very angry indeed. And that's just what Tolkien has to say about people translating his works. In different letters, he complains about the idea of people changing his words and creating art and adaptations based on his works. He was very precious about this, and with good reason. We've seen too many times what happens when people don't care about the work, but like the idea of playing in its sandbox. They destroy what was created, often attacking the original creator while doing it, and then go after anyone who likes the works as they were. This is how you get people like David Levitt saying ignorant things like this, quote, "The same racist Nazi fuckers who complained about a black elf in the Rings of Power and a black mermaid in the new Little Mermaid are now throwing a fit because there's a black Aragorn in the new Lord of the Rings Magic the Gathering set. I fucking hate how many racists there are in the board game spaces." The only racists I see are clowns like you who think black people are so shallow that we need every character to look like us. I'm black. I love the Lord of the Rings the way Tolkien wrote it. I've read the books every year since 2003. I've watched both versions of all 3 films at least 20 times. I can even recite the commentary track for the sound design. You can't tell me anything about loving the Lord of the Rings or Middle-earth. I don't need those characters to look like me to relate to any of them, and I don't need your racist revisions. So keep your forked tongue behind your teeth, Snake. And by the way, the cards aren't even consistent. For example, they race-swapped Aragorn and Galadriel, 2 characters who are explicitly described as having pale or fair skin, but Arwen, Galadriel's granddaughter, is white. In the book, Imrahil the Fair is a 50-something-year-old white dude, but now he's a young black guy. Legolas, who's known for his golden hair, is clearly not blonde. It's literally a defining characteristic telling you what clan of elves he's from, just ignored. Then we've got Asian Butterbur, Black Hobbit, Brown Man of Gondor, Blackish Westfold Rider, but the Easterling, you know, the ones who are supposed to be Asian, now they're white. White ginger woman. What is happening? Oh, it gets worse, because somehow when Gandalf the Asian dies, he's reborn as Gandalf the Black. It's the same person, race swapped. And he's not the only one. Meriadoc Brandybuck, white. Merry Esquire of Rohan, black. Same person. How is this happening? You'd think the people painting the pictures had no idea that these are the same people, but then there's clearly a mandate to depict Aragorn and Queen Cleo as black, so someone's telling these people who the characters are. How are you messing this up? But that's not the one. This is the one, and you really do need to look at the screen. Nothing is more important than this screen. Look at the screen. Here is Eomer, and here is his biological sister from the same 2 parents, Eowyn. How in the hell is he white and she's black if they have the same white parents? Wizards of the Coast were so busy trying to be inclusive and diverse that they didn't even keep track of the shit they were changing. And then they had the nerve to drag Elijah Wood into this and pay this man to make a video admitting that this is all just fanfiction. Yeah, we know. You didn't need to hire him to tell us that. This is why this stuff fails. It's not because everybody's a bigot. Sure, there are plenty of bigoted people who jump in to stoke the flames, but they aren't most of the people complaining, and they aren't the most vocal. This stuff fails because your claims that people can't relate to these stories and characters unless the characters are exactly like them are false. Millions of people have fallen in love with Tolkien's stories and related to his characters despite looking nothing like them because people are more than just their appearances. They are drawn to his characters because they want to know more about those characters, about those people. They see the similarities in their experiences and the characters, and that gives people a better understanding of themselves and of others. That's the whole point of storytelling, to convey ideas from one person to another so we understand those around us. When you race swap characters, you aren't making some grand statement about understanding, tolerance, or acceptance. You're just telling everyone that you're so shallow and narcissistic that you can't relate to anyone who isn't exactly like you. Maybe if you stopped pretending to like Tolkien's works and actually read his books, you'll learn to think better of others and yourself. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.